Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today because this story is something special. It's about unexpected connections, difficult choices, and a moment that changed everything. If you enjoy relaxing storytelling like this, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And feel free to say hello in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's begin.
The bruise on my left cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow-green, carefully concealed beneath 3 layers of foundation that I'd applied with trembling hands in the bathroom mirror at dawn. My reflection stared back at me with hollow eyes, a stranger wearing my face, someone I barely recognized anymore. The woman I used to be, the one who laughed freely and dreamed of opening her own bakery, had disappeared somewhere between the first slap and the 100th apology. Now I was just surviving, counting hours between Trevor's mood swings, walking on eggshells in my own home, if you could even call it that anymore. The charity gala at the Belmont Hotel was supposed to be safe territory. Public spaces always were. Trevor maintained his perfect facade in front of his colleagues and business associates, playing the devoted husband with such convincing charm that sometimes even I questioned my own memories of what happened behind our closed doors. He'd smile and place his hand on the small of my back with apparent tenderness, and nobody would notice how his fingers dug into my spine with enough pressure to leave marks, a silent reminder of his control. Tonight was no different. He'd dressed me himself, choosing the emerald silk gown that covered my arms and the fading fingerprint bruises around my wrists, zipping it up with possessive slowness while whispering threats disguised as compliments against my ear. We'd arrived fashionably late, Trevor's hand gripping my elbow as he guided me through the glittering crowd of Seattle's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across faces I recognized from society pages, people who lived in a world so far removed from my nightmare that they might as well have been on another planet. I smiled when expected, laughed at appropriate moments, played my role with the practiced precision of someone who knew the consequences of a single misstep. Trevor had been drinking steadily since we arrived, his grip on my arm tightening incrementally with each glass of scotch, his jovial mask slipping just enough for me to read the storm building behind his eyes. Then he'd seen her, Lauren Mitchell, his former business partner, the woman he'd spent months claiming had betrayed him, though I'd always suspected the truth was more complicated. She'd walked in wearing confidence like armor, her success evident in every deliberate step, and I'd felt Trevor's entire body go rigid beside me. His fingers had dug into my arm with sudden vicious force, and I'd bitten back a gasp of pain, knowing better than to draw attention. He'd leaned close, his breath hot and alcohol-soaked against my ear, and told me he needed to speak with someone privately. The translation was clear. I was to wait, to stay visible, to continue playing the perfect wife while he did whatever he deemed necessary. I'd nodded obediently, watching him disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in months, I'd felt something other than fear. Opportunity. The hotel's parking garage was just through the kitchen, past the service corridors that staff used to move unseen through the building. I'd memorized the exits weeks ago, a habit born from countless instances of needing to know where I could run, even when I knew running was impossible. My heart had begun racing with a dangerous hope as I'd calculated distances, timing, possibilities. The valet station would be busy, keys hanging on the board behind the desk, accessible if I moved quickly enough. I could take anyone's car, drive until I hit the highway, and keep going until Seattle was just a memory in my rearview mirror. The plan had formed in desperate fragments as I'd made my way toward the service entrance. Smiling blandly at a waiter who'd held the door open, the parking garage had been dimmer than I'd expected, the fluorescent lights creating pools of shadow between the rows of expensive vehicles. Mercedes, BMW, and Lexus. The automotive symbols of wealth and power that meant nothing to me now. I just needed something fast. Something that could put distance between me and Trevor before he realized I was gone. My hands had been shaking as I'd approached the valet station, finding it momentarily empty, the board of keys right there within reach. That's when I'd heard his voice echoing through the concrete space, closer than it should have been, calling my name with that particular edge that meant violence was imminent. Panic had seized my chest like a fist, squeezing the air from my lungs as I'd realized he'd followed me, or perhaps anticipated my pathetic attempt at escape. The keys had blurred before my eyes as I'd grabbed blindly, my fingers closing around a set attached to a distinctive keychain, black leather embossed with initials I hadn't stopped to read. The car had chirped in response somewhere to my left, and I'd run toward the sound on legs that barely supported my weight, my heels clicking frantically against the concrete. The vehicle was massive, a black SUV that gleamed even in the garage's dim lighting, clearly expensive and belonging to someone important. I hadn't cared. The back door had been unlocked, and I'd thrown myself inside, pulling it shut as quietly as possible, before diving onto the floor behind the driver's seat. The space had been cramped, my silk gown bunching uncomfortably beneath me, my heart hammering so violently I'd been certain Trevor would hear it from across the garage. I'd pressed my hand over my mouth, forcing my breathing to slow, listening to his footsteps growing closer, then pausing, then moving away. Minutes had passed like hours as I'd lain there, every muscle tensed, waiting for the door to be wrenched open, for his hands to drag me out, for the punishment I knew would follow. But the footsteps had faded, and eventually, I'd heard the distant sound of the elevator, and I'd allowed myself to believe just for a moment that I might actually be safe. That fragile sense of safety was shattered the moment I heard new footsteps approaching. These ones different from Trevor's angry stride. These were measured, purposeful, the confident gait of someone who owned not just the vehicle I was hiding in, but probably half the city. The electronic chirp of the key fob made my entire body go rigid, and I pressed myself flatter against the floor, praying that whoever was about to enter wouldn't look in the back, wouldn't notice the trembling woman in an evening gown wedged behind their driver's seat like some desperate criminal. The driver's door opened with a quiet click, and the SUV shifted slightly as someone slid into the seat. I held my breath, counting seconds, waiting for the inevitable discovery. But instead of starting the engine, the person sat in silence for a long moment. Then came the sound of a phone being dialed, the soft beeps cutting through the garage's ambient noise like knife strokes. The engine rumbled to life, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief that we were moving, that every second put more distance between me and Trevor. Terror that I had no idea who I'd trapped myself with or where we were going. The voice that spoke into the phone was deep, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that made people listen without question. He spoke in low tones, discussing shipments, territories, and numbers that meant nothing to me but everything to whatever business he conducted. There was an edge to his words, a casual menace that suggested violence was simply another tool in his arsenal, used when necessary without particular emotion. I recognized that quality because I'd lived with a pale imitation of it for 3 years. Trevor played at being dangerous, using his fists against someone he knew wouldn't fight back. This man didn't need to play at anything. The SUV navigated through what I assumed was the parking garage, making several turns before the sound changed, the echo of concrete giving way to open air. We were on the street now, moving through downtown Seattle's evening traffic. I could hear other vehicles around us, the muffled sounds of the city filtering through the SUV's luxury insulation. My legs were cramping from being folded in such an awkward position, and the silk of my gown was making me slide slightly with each turn. I shifted minutely, trying to redistribute my weight without making noise, but the fabric rustled softly. The conversation on the phone stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was more terrifying than Trevor's shouting had ever been. It was the silence of a predator who'd just detected prey, calculating and cold. The SUV didn't slow or stop. Instead, I heard a soft click and realized with dawning horror that he'd just locked all the doors. The central locking system engaged with a definitive thunk that sounded like a prison cell closing. His voice, when it came, was directed at me rather than the phone. He didn't turn around, nor did he adjust the rearview mirror to look at me. He simply stated with absolute certainty that I had 30 seconds to explain why I was hiding in his vehicle, or he'd assume I was a threat and act accordingly. The calmness in his tone was somehow more frightening than any rage. This was a man who dealt with actual threats, real danger, not the performative cruelty of an insecure husband. This was someone who would do exactly what he said without hesitation or remorse. I pushed myself up slightly, my arms shaking from more than just the cramped position. Through the gap between the seats, I could see the back of his head, dark hair cut with precise attention, the collar of what was clearly a custom-tailored suit. His shoulders were broad, his posture relaxed despite having just discovered a stowaway. That relaxation was somehow more unnerving than tension would have been. It suggested he was confident in his ability to handle whatever I might represent. My voice came out as a hoarse whisper when I finally spoke, explaining that I wasn't trying to steal his car, that I was running from someone, that I'd grabbed the first keys I could reach without thinking. The words tumbled out in a rushed confession, desperation overriding my usual careful control. I watched his hand on the steering wheel, noting the expensive watch, the signet ring on his right hand, the casual way he navigated through traffic while simultaneously assessing the threat level of the woman currently cowering behind his seat. He listened without interruption, his phone call apparently forgotten or ended, though I hadn't heard him disconnect. When I finished my halting explanation, he asked a single question. Who was I running from? Not why or how I'd ended up in his vehicle, but who. The question was precise, tactical, the inquiry of someone who understood that knowing your enemy was the first step in any conflict. I hesitated, some instinct warning me that naming Trevor would open a door I couldn't close, would pull me from one dangerous situation into another potentially worse one. But what choice did I have? I was locked in a vehicle with a stranger who radiated danger like heat from asphalt, driving to an unknown destination, with a husband somewhere behind me, who would be systematically searching for me with increasing violence. I told him Trevor's name, adding his company affiliation, the details spilling out because I'd kept them locked inside for so long that once the dam broke, everything flooded out. Trevor Hastings, real estate developer, pillar of the community, generous donor to children's charities, beloved by everyone who didn't have to live with him. The silence that followed my confession stretched long enough that I began to wonder if he'd heard me. Then he made another call, this one even briefer than the first. He spoke a name, Trevor Hastings, followed by an address I recognized as Trevor's downtown office, and then just 2 words. Find everything. The call ended and the SUV continued its smooth progress through the city streets. I realized we'd been driving for longer than I'd thought. The familiar sounds of downtown giving way to quieter neighborhoods, then to areas where traffic sounds faded almost entirely. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a dark amusement that made my skin prickle. He informed me that I'd chosen quite possibly the worst vehicle in Seattle to hide in if I was looking for a safe escape. Then he adjusted the rearview mirror with deliberate slowness, until his eyes met mine in the reflection, and I found myself staring into a gaze that was as cold and assessing as a surgeon's before making the first incision. He introduced himself with a name that carried weight in certain circles. Dante Carver, and from the way he said it, he expected recognition. I didn't disappoint him. Even isolated as I'd been in Trevor's carefully controlled world, I'd heard whispers about Dante Carver. He was the man other powerful men spoke about in lowered voices, the one whose business interests were varied enough to be legitimate, and concentrated enough to be clearly something else entirely. He owned half the commercial real estate in Seattle's Port District, ran security companies that protected everyone from tech billionaires to visiting foreign dignitaries, and was rumored to have connections that extended into territories where law became more suggestion than requirement. The SUV turned onto a private road, the smooth pavement giving way to cobblestones that created a rhythmic vibration through the vehicle's frame. I pulled myself up slightly, no longer bothering to hide now that my presence was thoroughly acknowledged, and caught glimpses of wrought iron gates closing behind us, of manicured grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly in the gathering darkness, of a house that was more estate than residence, all stone and glass and architectural authority. This was where men like Dante Carver lived, in fortresses disguised as homes, surrounded by security that was invisible, but undoubtedly comprehensive. He pulled into a garage that could have housed a dozen vehicles, though only a handful occupied the space. Each one was worth more than I'd earn in a lifetime, sleek machines that represented power and wealth in their most distilled forms. The engine cut off, and the silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken implications. I remained frozen in the back seat, uncertain whether I was a guest or prisoner, rescue or simply a different kind of captive. Dante made no move to exit, instead turning in his seat to face me directly for the first time, and I understood immediately why people spoke his name with such careful respect. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps early 30s, with features that would have been handsome if they weren't so carefully controlled. His face was all sharp angles and deliberate expressions, nothing accidental or unguarded, the countenance of someone who'd learned early that revealing vulnerability was inviting attack. His eyes were dark, nearly black in the garage's dim lighting, and they studied me with an intensity that felt like being catalogued, assessed, and filed away for future reference. He took in the concealed bruise on my cheekbone, the way I held myself with careful stillness, the expensive gown that was now wrinkled and disheveled from my time on the floor. His first question wasn't what I expected. He asked how long. Not how long had I been planning to leave, or how long had I been hiding in his car, but how long had Trevor been hitting me. The directness of it, the lack of polite deflection or comfortable euphemisms, caught me so off guard that I answered honestly. 3 years, I told him. Though the hitting hadn't started until after the first year, after the wedding, after I'd been legally bound to him and isolated from everyone I'd known before. It had begun small, a shove during an argument, a grip on my wrist that left marks, each incident followed by tears and apologies and promises that became more hollow with each repetition. Dante listened without visible reaction, his expression remaining neutral, but something shifted in the air between us. He stepped out of the SUV with fluid grace, then opened my door, extending a hand to help me out as if I were an invited guest rather than an uninvited stowaway. The courtesy felt surreal after hours of fear, and I hesitated before accepting, my hand trembling as it met his. His grip was firm, but careful, the touch of someone who understood exactly how much strength he possessed and controlled it with precision. He helped me out of the vehicle, and I stood on unsteady legs, my heels clicking against the polished garage floor. The house beyond the garage door was everything I'd imagined, and nothing I'd prepared for. We entered through a mudroom that was larger than my bedroom and Trevor's, passing into a kitchen that belonged in an architectural magazine, all marble counters and professional appliances and understated luxury. Everything was meticulously clean, organized with the kind of precision that suggested either obsessive attention to detail or a very efficient staff. Probably both. Dante guided me through the space with a light hand on my elbow, the gesture protective rather than possessive, a distinction I'd learned to recognize through painful experience. He led me to what appeared to be a study, all dark wood and leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that actually contained books, not just decorative spines chosen by an interior designer. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, casting warm light across the room despite the late spring weather not requiring heat. It was atmospheric, deliberately designed to put visitors at ease, or perhaps to provide comfortable surroundings for uncomfortable conversations. Dante gestured to a leather chair positioned near the fireplace, and I sank into it gratefully, my legs finally giving out as adrenaline began its inevitable crash. He moved to a bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of something amber and expensive-looking, returning to hand me one before settling into the chair opposite mine. The distance he maintained felt intentional, giving me space without crowding or intimidating me. It was so different from Trevor's constant need to loom, to use his physical presence as a weapon, that I felt tears prickling at my eyes for the first time since I'd fled the hotel. I took a sip of the drink, the liquid burning pleasantly down my throat, spreading warmth through my chest that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the first moment of genuine safety I'd felt in longer than I could remember. Dante began speaking, his voice low and measured, explaining the situation I'd inadvertently entered with a frankness that was almost refreshing in its lack of pretense. I'd chosen to hide in his vehicle, which meant I was now his responsibility, whether either of us had planned for that or not. He had a reputation to maintain, which included protecting what belonged to him. The phrasing made me stiffen, as belonging suggested ownership, but he continued before I could protest. He wasn't claiming to own me, he clarified, reading my reaction with unsettling accuracy. But I was now under his protection, and in his world. That meant something specific and binding. Trevor Hastings would be looking for me, he continued. And Trevor was the type of man who wouldn't simply let his possession walk away. Dante's choice of words was deliberate, calling me Trevor's possession rather than his wife's, acknowledging the reality of my situation with brutal honesty. By tomorrow morning, Trevor would have called in every favor, contacted every person who might have seen me leave the hotel, and traced every possible route I could have taken. He would be methodical about it, systematic, because men like Trevor couldn't tolerate being defied. couldn't accept that something they'd claimed had escaped their control. But here was the critical factor, Dante said, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Trevor Hastings was a predator who hunted in specific territories, using wealth and social connections as his weapons. Dante Carver operated in different territories entirely, where wealth was just one tool among many, and social connections held a different significance. The two worlds occasionally intersected, but they followed different rules, and Trevor's power meant nothing in Dante's sphere of influence. The statement wasn't a boast, just a fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood in Seattle's complex hierarchy. He made another call while I sat clutching my glass, watching flames dance in the fireplace, trying to process the surreal turn my desperate escape had taken. The conversation was brief, conducted in that same measured tone, giving instructions about guest rooms, clothing, and arrangements I couldn't quite follow. When he ended the call, he informed me that his housekeeper would prepare a room and provide something more comfortable to wear than an evening gown, and that I should rest while he dealt with the Trevor situation. The casual way he described it, as if my abusive husband was simply a situation to be dealt with rather than the monster who dominated my existence for 3 years, made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. I found my voice finally, asking the question that had been building since he'd locked the car doors. Why was he helping me? He didn't know me, owed me nothing, had every reason to simply dump me at the nearest police station and wash his hands of the entire inconvenient situation. Dante stood, moving to the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as he stared into the flames. His answer, when it came, wasn't what I expected. He told me about his sister, who was 5 years younger, and how she was bright and full of life until she married the wrong man. By the time Dante had realized what was happening, had seen past the carefully maintained facade, it had been too late. She'd died in what the police report called an unfortunate accident, a fall downstairs that broke her neck. The medical examiner had noted the healed fractures, the old bruises in various stages of fading, and the pattern of injuries consistent with prolonged abuse. But her husband had been wealthy, connected, respected in the community, and the investigation had gone nowhere. Dante's voice remained even as he recounted this, no emotion bleeding through, but his hand on the mantel had tightened into a fist, the only visible sign of the rage he kept carefully contained. He'd been away on business when it happened, he continued, unable to protect her when it mattered most. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The housekeeper who appeared was a woman in her 50s named Patricia, with kind eyes and the efficient demeanor of someone who'd worked in this house long enough to ask no questions while seeing everything. She guided me upstairs with gentle authority, making soft comments about the lovely evening gown I wore, as if finding disheveled women in her employer's study was a common occurrence. Perhaps it was. I had no frame of reference for what constituted normal in Dante Carver's world, and I was too exhausted to wonder about it with any real energy. The guest room was larger than the master bedroom I'd shared with Trevor, decorated in shades of cream and soft gray, with furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Patricia showed me the attached bathroom, stocked with toiletries still in their packaging, expensive brands I recognized from magazine advertisements but had never imagined using. She'd laid out clothing on the bed, simple pieces that looked brand new, tags still attached, in sizes that were somehow exactly right. When I asked how she'd known, Patricia simply smiled and said that Dante was very observant about details. After she left, I stood under the shower spray until the water ran cold, scrubbing away layers of fear and Trevor's cologne that seemed to have seeped into my skin during our drive to the hotel. The bathroom mirror had fogged completely by the time I emerged, wrapping myself in a thick, luxurious towel, the kind of simple pleasure I'd forgotten could exist. I dressed in the clothes Patricia had provided, soft leggings and an oversized sweater that felt like being enveloped by something gentle and safe. My evening gown lay in a crumpled heap on the bathroom floor, and I left it there, unable to touch it again. Sleep should have been impossible, but the moment I lay down on the bed, exhaustion claimed me with the weight of 3 years of hypervigilance finally releasing its grip. I dreamed in fragments, disjointed images of running through parking garages that stretched endlessly, of Trevor's face morphing into something monstrous, of dark eyes watching from the rearview mirror of a vehicle that drove through streets I didn't recognize, I woke several times, disoriented, heart racing, before remembering where I was and why. Each time, the unfamiliar safety of the room settled over me like a blanket, and I drifted back into uneasy rest. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through curtains I didn't remember closing, and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere downstairs. I found my way to the kitchen following the scent, padding barefoot across hardwood floors that were warm despite the early hour, suggesting radiant heating beneath. Dante sat at a massive kitchen island, laptop open in front of him, several phones arranged within easy reach, looking as impeccably put together as he had the night before, despite the hour being barely past dawn. He glanced up at my entrance, gesturing to the coffee maker with a slight nod. I poured myself a cup with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months, adding cream from a container that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to. The domestic normalcy of the moment felt surreal, standing in a stranger's kitchen, drinking excellent coffee, while my entire life lay in ruins somewhere behind me. Dante closed his laptop with a decisive click, giving me his full attention in a way that was both flattering and unnerving. He had news about Trevor, he said, his tone suggesting I should sit down for this conversation. Trevor had reported me missing to the police around midnight, playing the distraught husband with what Dante's sources described as an Oscar-worthy performance. He'd claimed I'd been depressed, possibly suicidal, that he was desperately worried about my mental state. Several officers who responded knew Trevor socially, having attended the same charity functions and played golf at the same exclusive club. They'd taken his report seriously, issued an alert, and begun the process of searching for a vulnerable woman who might be in danger of harming herself. The manipulation of it, the way Trevor had twisted my escape into a narrative that made him the concerned victim, made my stomach turn. But Dante had made some calls of his own. He continued, taking a measured sip of his coffee. By 3 a.m, certain information had reached certain people who owed Dante favors. Information about Trevor's business dealings, the creative accounting that funded his lifestyle, the investors he'd defrauded, the shell companies hiding money from tax authorities. Nothing illegal enough to warrant immediate arrest, but certainly enough to warrant investigation, to make Trevor's life complicated in ways that would occupy his attention and resources. The police alert for me would remain active, but Trevor would suddenly find himself dealing with audits and inquiries that demanded his immediate focus. I stared at Dante, trying to process how completely he'd dismantled Trevor's advantages in less than 12 hours. The man who'd controlled every aspect of my life for 3 years, who'd seemed untouchable in his wealth and connections, was now scrambling to protect himself from consequences Dante had engineered with a few phone calls. It should have felt like victory, but instead, I felt hollow, uncertain what came next. I couldn't go back to my old life. Couldn't return to the apartment I'd shared with Trevor. Couldn't even contact the few friends I had left after he'd systematically isolated me from everyone I'd known before our marriage. Dante seemed to understand my silence, the way I sat frozen with my coffee cup halfway to my lips, staring at nothing while my mind tried to map a future that had no clear shape. He had a proposition, he said, the word choice making me tense immediately. Not that kind of proposition, he clarified quickly, reading my reaction with that same unsettling accuracy. He needed someone to manage his household, someone intelligent and observant who could be trusted with sensitive information. Patricia was excellent, but she was approaching retirement, planning to move closer to her grandchildren within the year. The position would come with a salary, benefits, living quarters in the house, and most importantly, the protection of being associated with his name. It was a business arrangement, he emphasized, watching my face carefully as he outlined the terms. I would work for him, manage his domestic affairs, coordinate with his staff, and handle the logistics of running an estate like this one. In return, I would gain financial independence, security, and the freedom to explore my life's direction without the shadow of Trevor's influence. The arrangement would continue until I decided I wanted something different, no strings attached beyond the professional expectations of the role. He pulled a folder from beside his laptop, sliding it across the marble counter toward me, a formal contract already prepared. I should have been suspicious of how convenient it all was, how perfectly the solution addressed my immediate needs while binding me to this dangerous stranger's household. But I'd spent 3 years in a beautiful prison, wearing expensive clothes and attending exclusive events while slowly dying inside. Dante's offer felt different, practical rather than possessive, transactional rather than controlling. I could see the clear boundaries in the contract terms, the escape clauses, and the definitions of responsibility that protected both parties. It was more respect than Trevor had ever shown me, more autonomy than I'd had since the day I'd signed a marriage certificate without reading the fine print of what that commitment would actually cost. I asked about Trevor. What would happen when he inevitably found out where I was? Dante's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his dark eyes. Trevor would be informed, through appropriate channels, that I was under protection, and any attempt to contact or threaten me would have consequences. In Dante's world, consequences weren't legal actions or restraining orders that men like Trevor ignored. Consequences were concrete and immediate, delivered by people who didn't care about social standing or country club memberships. Trevor would understand the message, Dante said with quiet certainty, because men like Trevor were fundamentally cowards who only bullied those they perceived as weaker. I signed the contract with a pen that probably cost more than my car used to, my signature looking shaky and uncertain on the expensive paper. Dante countersigned with a flourish, then extended his hand across the counter, sealing our agreement with a handshake that felt weighted with significance I couldn't fully understand yet. "Welcome to the household," he said, something almost like approval in his tone. Patricia would train me on the specific requirements and preferences, introduce me to the rest of the staff, and help me settle into the role. For now, I should rest, recover, and let my body and mind process the trauma of the past 24 hours. But first, he said, standing and gesturing for me to follow him, there was something I needed to see. We walked through the house, past rooms I'd only glimpsed the night before, until we reached what appeared to be a home office far more substantial than the study where we'd talked. The walls were covered in screens displaying various angles of the property, the gates, and the surrounding streets on security monitors. Dante touched a panel, and one screen shifted to show footage from the previous night, the hotel parking garage captured from an angle I hadn't known existed. I watched myself on the screen, a desperate figure in an emerald gown, stealing keys and diving into Dante's SUV with the frantic energy of someone who'd finally broken. The footage was crystal clear, every detail visible, including the moment Trevor's face appeared in the frame, searching the parking garage with barely controlled rage. He'd been closer than I'd realized, close enough that if I'd hesitated even a few seconds longer, he would have caught me. The reality of how narrow my escape had been made my knees weak, and I gripped the edge of Dante's desk for support. Dante switched to a different feed, which showed the hotel's main entrance from earlier in the evening. I watched as Trevor and I arrived, saw the way his hand gripped my arm, and the forced smile on my face that looked genuine enough from a distance, but was clearly strained when you knew what to look for. The footage continued, showing Trevor's reaction when he'd spotted Lauren Mitchell, the way his entire demeanor had shifted from performative charm to something darker. Dante had somehow acquired security footage from multiple sources, creating a comprehensive timeline of the evening that documented everything. He explained that he'd had his people pull every available camera feed from the hotel and surrounding area within an hour of discovering me in his vehicle. It was standard procedure when unknown variables entered his world, a way of understanding context and potential threats. What the footage showed was a clear pattern of control and intimidation, Trevor's body language throughout the evening speaking volumes to anyone trained to read such things. Dante had already provided copies to certain contacts, people who might need to understand the situation if Trevor tried to spin narratives about his missing, mentally unstable wife. The screens shifted again, this time showing current feeds from various locations around the city. One displayed the exterior of Trevor's downtown office, where 2 unmarked cars were parked with the patient stillness of law enforcement conducting surveillance. Another showed his favorite lunch spot, his gym, and the building where our apartment was located. Dante's network was extensive, I realized with a mixture of awe and unease, his reach extending into places I'd assumed were private, protected, beyond the scope of anyone's observation. In his world, privacy was an illusion, security was active rather than passive, and information was the most valuable currency. He told me that Trevor had already tried to hire a private investigator to find me, but the investigator in question happened to owe Dante several significant favors. The man had accepted Trevor's money and would provide him with false leads, dead ends, and wild goose chases that would keep him occupied and frustrated. Meanwhile, Dante's own people would monitor Trevor's movements, his communications, his attempts to locate me. If Trevor got too close or became too dangerous, they would intervene in ways that would appear coincidental, but were carefully orchestrated. I was protected not by walls or locks, but by a web of surveillance and influence that Trevor couldn't even perceive, let alone penetrate. I should have been disturbed by the scope of it, the casual way Dante discussed monitoring and manipulation, as if they were ordinary business practices. But I'd lived for 3 years with the constant awareness that Trevor tracked my phone, read my emails, and questioned every moment I spent away from his direct supervision. At least Dante's surveillance was protecting me rather than imprisoning me, watching for threats rather than creating them. The distinction felt significant, even if the methods were uncomfortably similar. I was trading one form of control for another, but this version came with a salary, boundaries, and most importantly, an exit strategy. Patricia appeared in the doorway, announcing that breakfast was ready if we were hungry. The domestic interruption felt jarring after the intensity of watching surveillance footage, but Dante switched off the screens with practiced ease, transforming instantly from calculating strategist to courteous host. We moved to a dining room that could have seated 20, though only 2 places were set at one end of the long table, close enough for conversation without the awkward distance of formal dining. The food was simple but perfectly prepared: eggs, toast, and fresh fruit that tasted like it had been picked that morning. We ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Dante began explaining the household routines, the expectations of my new role, and the various staff members I'd be coordinating with. There was Miguel, who managed the grounds and exterior security; James, who served as Dante's personal driver and handled various other tasks that Dante described vaguely as logistics; Patricia, whom I'd already met, and her assistant Rosa, who handled the actual cleaning while Patricia managed overall operations. A rotating security team that worked in shifts, maintaining surveillance and responding to potential threats. And finally, Dante's personal assistant, Christina, who worked from an office downtown but coordinated closely with the household staff. My role would be to act as the central point of contact between all these moving parts, ensuring Dante's life ran smoothly without him having to worry about domestic details. I would manage his schedule at home, coordinate with Christina on matters that required household resources, handle any guests or events he hosted, and generally keep the estate functioning with invisible efficiency. Patricia would train me for the next few weeks, showing me Dante's preferences, introducing me to suppliers and service providers, and teaching me the systems that kept everything running. It sounded straightforward enough, though I suspected the reality would be more complex than the description suggested. After breakfast, Patricia took over my orientation with the gentle authority of someone who'd perfected household management over decades of practice. She showed me the systems that controlled lighting, climate, security, and the integration of technology that made the house respond to anticipated needs before they were explicitly stated. She introduced me to the pantry, which was organized with restaurant-level precision, the wine cellar, which contained bottles worth more than cars, and the linen closet, where sheets were categorized by thread count and seasonal weight. Every detail had been considered, every preference documented, every potential need anticipated. The scope of wealth required to maintain this level of existence was staggering, but Patricia explained it with practical matter-of-factness, as if discussing a moderately successful household, rather than an estate that required a full staff to operate. Dante traveled frequently, she told me, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. During those periods, the house ran on minimal staff, just herself and Rosa maintaining things until his return. But when he was in residence, especially if he was entertaining, the full team would be activated, each person performing their role with choreographed precision. She showed me to what would be my permanent quarters, a suite on the 2nd floor with its own sitting room, bedroom, and bathroom. It was larger and nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived, decorated with the same understated elegance as the rest of the house. Patricia explained that I should feel free to personalize the space, that it was truly mine for as long as I worked here. The sentiment felt foreign after years of living in an apartment where Trevor controlled every decoration, every piece of furniture, every element of our environment. The idea of having space that was genuinely my own, that I could modify according to my preferences, felt almost too good to believe. The rest of the day passed in a blur of information, names, procedures, and systems. Patricia was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, answering my questions without making me feel ignorant for asking. By evening, my head was swimming with details, but I was starting to understand the scope of my new responsibilities. It was real work, demanding and complex. Nothing like the decorative wife role Trevor had assigned me. I would be busy, engaged, using skills I'd forgotten I possessed during years of being systematically diminished. Dante appeared at dinner, having spent most of the day in meetings either in his home office or away from the property entirely. He asked how the orientation was going, whether I felt overwhelmed, and if I had concerns about any aspect of the position. The questions seemed genuine rather than performative, and I found myself answering honestly, admitting that it was a lot to absorb, but that I was grateful for the opportunity. Something shifted in his expression when I said that. Gratitude clearly not something he heard often, and he simply nodded before returning his attention to his meal. The first week passed in a strange suspension of reality, each day blurring into the next as I absorbed information and gradually stepped into my role. Patricia was endlessly patient, correcting my mistakes with gentle humor and praising small successes with genuine warmth. The other staff members accepted my presence with varying degrees of curiosity and reservation, but nobody questioned my sudden appearance or the circumstances that had brought me here. In Dante's world, discretion was apparently valued above all else, and asking personal questions violated an unspoken code. Trevor called Dante's office on the fourth day. Christina, Dante's assistant, informed me of this during one of our coordination meetings, explaining that Trevor had presented himself as a concerned husband, trying to locate his mentally unstable wife. Christina had followed protocol, which apparently meant expressing sympathy while providing no information whatsoever, and documenting the call in case it became part of a larger pattern. The knowledge that Trevor was actively searching for me should have terrified me, but somehow insulated within Dante's protected world. The threat felt distant and manageable. Dante himself remained a compelling enigma, present but not intrusive, observant without being controlling. He worked long hours, often taking calls at odd times, maintaining an empire I was only beginning to understand through context clues and overheard conversations. He was unfailingly polite to his staff, demanding but fair, expecting excellence without requiring perfection. I watched him interact with various people who came to the house for meetings, noting how he calibrated his demeanor to each situation, sometimes charming, sometimes intimidating, always absolutely in control. We developed an evening routine where we'd often find ourselves in the kitchen around the same time, making late meals after everyone else had left for the day. These weren't planned encounters, but they happened with increasing frequency, both of us apparently keeping similar irregular hours. We'd talk while cooking, conversations that ranged from practical household matters to surprisingly personal topics. He asked about my life before Trevor, and I found myself telling him about the bakery I'd dreamed of opening, the culinary school scholarship I'd declined because Trevor had convinced me it was impractical. Dante listened with focused attention, asking questions that demonstrated he was actually hearing what I said rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. It was such a stark contrast to Trevor's dismissive responses to anything I'd cared about that I sometimes found myself getting emotional, grateful tears threatening to spill over at the simple dignity of being listened to. Dante never commented on these moments, simply continuing the conversation naturally, giving me space to compose myself without drawing attention to my vulnerability. He told me about his sister during one of these late-night kitchen conversations, expanding on the bare facts he'd shared that first night. Her name had been Isabella, and she'd been brilliant, studying architecture, designing buildings that would have changed skylines if she'd lived long enough to see them realized. Her husband had seemed perfect initially, charming and successful, from a good family with all the right connections. By the time Isabella had confided in Dante that something was wrong, she'd been so isolated and controlled that intervention became nearly impossible. The guilt in his voice when he talked about it was palpable, the weight of coulda, shoulda, woulda that no amount of rationalization could lift. He'd been building his business, traveling constantly, and he'd failed to see the signs until it was far too late. Isabella's death had transformed him, he said, redirecting his ambitions toward accumulating the kind of power that would ensure he never felt helpless again. Everything he'd built since then, every strategic move and calculated risk, could be traced back to that fundamental failure and his determination to never repeat it. I understood then why he'd helped me. why my situation had triggered such an immediate and comprehensive response. I wasn't just a woman in trouble. I was a chance at redemption, an opportunity to save someone when he hadn't been able to save his sister. The realization should have made me feel like a proxy, a replacement for someone I could never actually replace. But instead, it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Dante understood exactly what Trevor had done to me, because he'd watched it happen to someone he loved, and that shared understanding created a connection I hadn't anticipated. By the end of the second week, I'd largely taken over household management from Patricia, who was transitioning into an advisory role. I coordinated staff schedules, managed supply orders, and handled the logistics of Dante's increasingly complex social calendar. He was hosting a dinner party in 3 days, Christina informed me. 8 guests, all important business associates, were expecting food and service that reflected Dante's status and taste. It would be my first major test, and I approached it with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove. I spent 2 days planning the menu, coordinating with the catering company Dante preferred, arranging the dining room with Patricia's guidance, and ensuring every detail was perfect. The morning of the dinner, I was up before dawn, supervising deliveries, checking that the florist had followed specifications, and confirming timing with the catering staff. Dante found me in the dining room that afternoon, adjusting place settings with obsessive precision, and told me with dry amusement that I was going to be excellent at this job if I didn't give myself a nervous breakdown first. The dinner itself went flawlessly, each course timed perfectly, service smooth and unobtrusive, conversation flowing easily around the table. I stayed mostly behind the scenes, coordinating with catering staff to ensure drinks were refreshed and dishes cleared at appropriate intervals. But I could hear fragments of conversation, business discussions conducted in careful language that revealed nothing explicit while conveying everything important. These were powerful people, I realized, moving pieces on boards I couldn't even see, playing games with stakes I could only imagine. One guest arrived late, entering through the front door with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to being important. I was in the foyer when he walked in, and his eyes traveled over me with an assessment that felt invasive despite the professional distance I maintained. He asked if I was new, said he didn't recognize me from previous visits to Dante's home. I confirmed I was recently hired, taking his coat with practiced efficiency, but something in his attention made my skin crawl. He reminded me of Trevor, that same entitled ownership in his gaze, the assumption that service meant availability. Dante appeared in the doorway to the dining room at that moment, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp as he took in the scene. He greeted his guest with surface warmth, guiding him toward the others with a hand on his shoulder that looked friendly but was clearly steering. As they moved away, Dante glanced back at me, a silent question in his eyes. I shook my head slightly, indicating I was fine, and something like approval flickered across his face before he returned his full attention to his guests. The rest of the evening proceeded without incident, and by midnight, all the guests had departed, the catering staff had cleaned and left, and I was alone in the kitchen doing a final check of everything. Dante found me there, loosening his tie with one hand while holding a bottle of wine in the other. He poured 2 glasses without asking, handing me one before leaning against the counter with visible exhaustion. The dinner had been successful, he said. Several important agreements reached, relationships strengthened, future opportunities established. And the food had been exceptional, the service impeccable, everything exactly as it should have been. I accepted the praise with a flush of satisfaction, realizing how much I'd needed to prove my competence, to demonstrate that I was earning my place here, rather than simply being sheltered out of pity. Dante seemed to understand this without me having to explain it, the same way he seemed to understand so many things I didn't say out loud. He asked about the guest who'd arrived late, whether the man had said or done anything inappropriate. I hesitated, not wanting to make something out of nothing, but Dante's expression made it clear he'd already drawn his own conclusions from what he'd observed. That particular guest wouldn't be invited back, Dante said matter-of-factly, taking a sip of his wine. He didn't tolerate disrespect toward his staff, and he especially didn't tolerate predatory behavior in his home. The decisiveness of it, the way he simply eliminated the problem without requiring me to make a formal complaint or justify my discomfort, felt revolutionary. Trevor had always accused me of overreacting, of being too sensitive, of inviting unwanted attention through my own behavior. Dante simply believed me, protected me, and moved on. The third week brought an unexpected complication in the form of a phone call that came directly to the house's landline, a number that was supposedly unlisted and known only to a select few. I answered with the professional greeting Patricia had taught me, identifying the residents without providing specifics. The voice on the other end was instantly recognizable despite the months since I'd last heard it. My mother, sounding frantic and confused, demanded to know where I was and why Trevor had told her I was missing. My hands went numb around the receiver as she continued, explaining that Trevor had contacted her 2 days ago, presenting himself as the devastated husband whose wife had disappeared without warning. He'd suggested I might be having a breakdown, that I'd been struggling with depression, that I might be a danger to myself. My mother, who'd never particularly liked Trevor, but had approved of his financial stability and social standing, had been appropriately horrified. She'd been trying to reach me ever since, calling my old phone number repeatedly, growing increasingly panicked when I didn't respond. I struggled to find words that would explain the unexplainable, how to condense 3 years of abuse into a phone call that wouldn't sound like excuses or delusions. My mother had never understood why I'd changed after marrying Trevor, why I'd stopped visiting, why I'd gradually cut off contact with everyone I'd known before. She'd attributed it to newlywed self-absorption, to me thinking I was too good for my family now that I'd married into wealth. The reality that Trevor had systematically isolated me while maintaining his perfect facade seemed too complicated to convey over the phone. Dante appeared in the doorway while I was still fumbling through halting explanations, taking in my distress with immediate assessment. He gestured for the phone, and I handed it over with relief and trepidation. He introduced himself with calm authority, explaining that I was employed at his residence, that I was safe and well, and that Trevor's characterization of the situation was incomplete at best. He suggested that my mother might want to hear Trevor's version of events with some skepticism, given certain facts that were becoming apparent through ongoing investigations. My mother's voice, tinny through the speaker, demanded to know who he thought he was, making accusations about her daughter's husband. Dante responded with patient firmness, outlining just enough detail about Trevor's business irregularities to plant seeds of doubt, without revealing sources or methods. He concluded by providing his direct number, suggesting she call if she had concerns about my well-being, and assuring her that I would reach out when I was ready. The entire conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the end, my mother's frantic edge had softened into something more thoughtful. After he hung up, Dante asked how much my mother knew about what Trevor had done to me. The answer was nothing, because I'd hidden it perfectly, maintaining the illusion of happiness during our increasingly rare interactions. Shame had kept me silent. The terrible conviction that somehow I'd deserved it, that I'd failed at being a good enough wife to prevent Trevor's violence. Dante's expression darkened as I explained this, and he said something I needed to hear but hadn't expected. None of it had been my fault. Not the abuse, not the isolation, not the systematic destruction of my sense of self. Trevor had chosen violence, had chosen control, and those choices belonged entirely to him. The validation should have felt hollow coming from someone who barely knew me, but instead it struck something deep and fundamental, cracking open a wall I'd built around my own culpability. I found myself crying for the first time since I'd arrived. Not the careful, silent tears I'd perfected during my marriage, but genuine sobbing that shook my entire body. Dante let me fall apart without trying to fix it or make it stop, simply standing nearby in case I needed something, giving me space to process emotions I'd suppressed for years. When the storm finally subsided, leaving me exhausted and raw, he suggested I take the rest of the day off, that Patricia could handle anything that came up. I should rest, he said. Maybe call my mother back when I felt ready, begin the process of rebuilding connections Trevor had worked so hard to destroy. The gentleness in his voice, coming from someone who projected such controlled power to the rest of the world, made me wonder what Isabella had been like, whether she'd brought out this softer side of her brother before her husband had killed her. I spent the afternoon in my room, staring at my phone, trying to compose what I'd say to my mother. The truth felt too large and too small simultaneously, too much to explain, and too simple to justify 3 years of silence. Eventually, I settled on a text message, brief but honest, explaining that I'd left Trevor because he'd hurt me, that I was safe now and working for someone who was helping me get back on my feet. I told her I needed time to think before discussing it in detail, but I loved her and was sorry for disappearing. Her response came within minutes, a wall of text that oscillated between relief, anger, guilt, and fierce maternal protectiveness. She'd suspected something was wrong, she wrote, but hadn't known how to reach me through Trevor's careful control. She'd tried calling a few times in the early years, but Trevor had always answered, explaining that I was busy, sleeping, or not feeling well. Eventually, she'd stopped trying, assuming I'd chosen wealth and status over family. The revelation that her assumptions had been wrong, that I'd been trapped rather than merely distant, was clearly devastating her. We texted back and forth for over an hour, with me gradually filling in pieces of the story as she responded with increasing horror and outrage. She wanted me to come home, back to the small town where I'd grown up, where she could protect me the way she'd failed to protect me from Trevor. But I explained that I needed to stay here, that returning would make me too easy to find, that I was safer under Dante's protection than I would be anywhere else. She didn't understand that part, couldn't grasp why a stranger's security would be more reliable than family, but she eventually accepted it with reluctant trust. By dinner time, I felt wrung out but somehow lighter, as if acknowledging the truth out loud had released some of the poison I'd been carrying. I found Dante in his study, working through a stack of contracts with the focused intensity he brought to everything. He glanced up when I knocked, gesturing me in with a slight smile that suggested he'd been expecting me. I thanked him for handling the call with my mother, for giving me the space to fall apart, for not judging me for the weakness I'd shown. He set down his pen with deliberate care, giving me his full attention in that way that made you feel like the most important person in his world for that moment. What I'd shown wasn't weakness, he said, but the opposite. Breaking down required trust, vulnerability, and the courage to let someone see you at your lowest. I'd survived 3 years of abuse that would have destroyed weaker people, and I was still standing, still fighting to rebuild my life. That was the strength of a kind most people never had to discover in themselves. The conversation shifted to practical matters, his way of moving past emotional intensity before it became uncomfortable. Trevor's financial troubles were accelerating, Dante reported, and several investors were now asking difficult questions about their returns. The IRS had opened a formal inquiry into his tax filings, and certain business partners were quietly distancing themselves from potential scandal. Within a few months, Trevor would be too preoccupied with saving his own reputation and assets to focus much energy on finding me. The strategy was working exactly as Dante had planned. I asked what would happen if Trevor somehow tracked me here, if he showed up at the gates demanding to see his wife. Dante's expression went cold in a way I'd never seen directed at me, and he said simply that Trevor would be turned away, by force if necessary, and that any subsequent attempts would be met with escalating consequences. The house security wasn't just cameras and alarms, he explained, but trained personnel who knew how to handle threats without creating public incidents. Trevor would quickly learn that pursuing me further would cost more than his pride could afford. The reassurance should have been comforting, but something in Dante's tone suggested the consequences he'd alluded to would be severe in ways I probably didn't want to understand. I was protected by association with someone who operated in worlds where violence was a tool rather than a taboo, and that protection came with the weight of knowing what it might require. But I'd made my choice when I'd signed that contract, when I'd accepted safety in exchange for whatever moral complexity came with Dante's methods. I couldn't claim innocence about who was protecting me. A month passed with surprising speed, days filled with the demanding work of managing Dante's household and the slower work of rebuilding myself. Patricia officially retired at the end of week 5, moving to Portland to be near her grandchildren, leaving me fully in charge with a confidence I'd gradually earned. The staff responded well to my management style, which Patricia had described as firm but fair, organized but flexible. I'd found my rhythm, my competence, my value in a role that was genuinely mine. Trevor's harassment had indeed diminished as his legal and financial problems multiplied. He'd stopped calling Dante's office after the 3rd attempt yielded nothing, and his private investigator had apparently given up after chasing false leads across 3 states. My mother reported that he'd contacted her once more, trying to convince her I'd been kidnapped or brainwashed. But she'd hung up on him and blocked his number. The missing persons report remained technically active, but no one was actively searching for a woman who clearly didn't want to be found. Dante's birthday fell on a Thursday in late spring, and I'd spent weeks planning a private celebration that would acknowledge the occasion without the performative excess he clearly despised. Just the household staff and a few close associates. An elegant dinner rather than a lavish party, meaningful rather than ostentatious. I'd learned his preferences through careful observation, the subtle tells that revealed what he actually enjoyed versus what he tolerated for business purposes. He appreciated quality over quantity, intimacy over spectacle, and genuine connection over social performance. The evening exceeded my hopes, conversation flowing easily, laughter genuine rather than polite. Dante visibly relaxed in a way I rarely witnessed. He caught my eye across the table at one point, raising his glass in silent acknowledgement of what I'd created, and the warmth in his expression made my breath catch. Something had been building between us over the past weeks, something neither of us had acknowledged but both of us felt. The late-night kitchen conversations had grown longer, more personal, charged with an awareness that transcended employer and employee. After the guests departed and the staff had cleaned up and left for the night, I found Dante on the back terrace, looking out over the grounds that stretched into darkness, punctuated by carefully placed lighting. He'd removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, the careful polish of the evening giving way to something more relaxed. I joined him without asking permission, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. He thanked me for the evening, his voice low and intimate, then added that I'd given him something he hadn't had in years. A sense of home. The confession hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us had been willing to voice until now. I turned to face him, finding his dark eyes already watching me with an intensity that made my pulse race. The air felt electric with possibility, with the weight of everything unspoken finally demanding acknowledgement. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, his fingers brushing my jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything dangerous about him. I leaned into the touch, my own hand coming up to cover his, and whatever invisible boundary had existed between us dissolved. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable and perfect, tender and fierce simultaneously, expressing everything we'd been carefully not saying for weeks. His other hand found the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I pressed against him with a hunger that surprised me. 3 years of being touch-starved by someone who'd only hurt me transforming into desperate need for someone who made me feel safe. We broke apart eventually, both breathing heavily, foreheads resting together as we processed what had just shifted between us. "This changed things," Dante said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. We needed to acknowledge that and be honest about what it meant for my employment and the power dynamic that already existed between us. He wouldn't take advantage, wouldn't pressure me into anything I didn't freely choose. But he needed me to understand that his feelings had evolved beyond professional respect into something far more complicated. If I wanted to maintain strictly business boundaries, he would accept that and never mention this again. But if I wanted to explore what was happening between us, he was willing to navigate that complexity together. I appreciated the directness with which he laid out options, without assuming my answer or pressuring my choice. It was so fundamentally different from how Trevor had operated, demanding compliance while pretending to offer choices, that I felt tears threatening again. But these were different tears, relief and hope, rather than pain and despair. I told Dante I wanted to explore this, whatever it was, but I was doing so slowly and carefully, giving myself time to learn how to trust again. He deserved someone who could meet him fully rather than bringing all my broken pieces, and I needed space to reassemble myself before offering anything real. He accepted this with understanding that felt like another gift, agreeing that we'd move at whatever pace I needed, that rebuilding trust couldn't be rushed or forced. What we had was worth protecting, worth treating with the care it deserved. The kiss had been an acknowledgement, not a beginning, but a promise of a potential beginning when I was ready. Until then, we would continue as we'd been. Employer and employee. Friends who were becoming something more. Two people who understood each other's damage and chose connection anyway. Standing on that terrace with Dante's arms around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of escape I'd carried into his SUV that terrifying night, but genuine hope for a future I could build rather than survive. I'd hidden in a Mafia boss's car to escape my abusive husband, and he'd locked the doors and made a call that had ultimately saved my life. Now I was standing in his home, in his arms, choosing to stay, not because I was trapped, but because I was finally, impossibly, free.